A pilot's reckless mistakes ended in a deadly disaster when shortly after takeoff, the King Air 350 he was flying began a sharp turn to the left. The co-pilot yelled out, "You just lost your left engine." The pilot tried to save the aircraft, but it continued rolling to the left, crashing nearly inverted just 17 seconds after takeoff, killing all 10 people on board. And the shocking truth was that there was nothing wrong with the left engine. And that's why in this video, I'm going to explain what happened and the reckless mistakes that led to this terrible tragedy. I'm Hoover and welcome to your pilot debrief. On June 30th, 2019, two pilots were getting their King Air 350 ready to take 8 passengers from Addison, Texas to St. Petersburg, Florida. Even though you only need one pilot to fly the aircraft, it's not uncommon to have a second pilot on board to help with the checklist, the radios, and the passengers. And in this case, the pilot flying liked to have a second pilot with him whenever he flew. The pilot in command in the left seat is 71 years old, and he has over 16,000 hours of total flight time with 1,100 hours in this make and model. He had just completed his recurrent training about 3 months prior to the crash, where he was described as super strong on King Air knowledge, and his instructor said he performed well on the simulated single-engine failure on takeoff. However, this training was done in the aircraft and not in the simulator, and that means it wasn't as realistic as it could have been because the scenario was done at a safe altitude and configuration after they got airborne. The co-pilot in the right seat is 28 years old and has just over 2,300 hours of total flight time. He was not qualified to operate the controls of the King Air 350, nor was he required to be. Remember, he's there to assist the pilot in command, and he has plenty of experience and was described as a very strong co-pilot. As the pilots were getting ready for the flight, the co-pilot greeted the passengers and loaded their luggage into the baggage compartment. According to witnesses, no scale was present and none of the bags were weighed. And in my opinion, this was one of the first reckless mistakes they made because they knew that all 4 of their fuel tanks were filled with 329 gallons of fuel and they had a full load with 8 passengers on board. This means they should have been thinking about their max allowable takeoff weight, but they didn't. 2 individuals who had previously flown with the pilot in command stated that he wasn't known for computing weight and balance. They said if he was familiar with the plane, he just wouldn't do it. The NTSB discovered that the aircraft was about 600 pounds over the max allowable takeoff weight. However, they concluded that the aircraft rate of climb on takeoff was what would be expected at maximum weight, and that extra weight likely wasn't a factor in the accident. But just because it didn't cause the crash doesn't mean that this is an acceptable practice. Too many crashes have happened simply because the pilot neglected to calculate their weight and balance prior to takeoff. One of the most helpful pieces of evidence in the investigation was the cockpit voice recorder. And I want you to pay attention to the timeline of events because the pace at which things happen is going to be very relevant to the crash. At 8:59 a.m., the co-pilot witnessed the passengers walking out of the hangar. The pilot had planned for a 9 a.m. departure time, but at 9:02 a.m. he's heard saying, "All right, people, let's get our butts in order." One of the passengers is overheard saying, "Take good care of me." Tragically, they had no idea what was about to happen on this flight. About 30 seconds later, the first engine is started, and then 15 seconds later, the second engine is started. Other than the sound of the engine starting and the avionics booting up, nothing else is heard in the cockpit until 2 minutes later when the pilot is given taxi instructions to runway 15. Nothing else of significance is heard in the cockpit during their taxi, and at 9:08:22, the controller asked if they'll be ready to go when they get to the end of the runway. At 9:09:41, they are cleared for takeoff, and at 9:10 and 10 seconds, the sound of the propeller RPM increasing is heard as the pilot applied takeoff power. We're going to pause right here because something is wrong. Now, if you haven't noticed it, so far there's been no mention of any checklist being accomplished, and that's really frustrating. You know, the pilots never called for or discussed the before engine start, the engine start, the before taxi, or the before takeoff checklist. There's a reason we have checklists. It's been said that the warnings you see in the checklist are written in blood. In other words, someone died and their death resulted in a new warning being added to the checklist. So it doesn't matter how many hours you have or how experienced you think you are in the aircraft, you should always use the checklist, even if it's just to back yourself up to make sure you didn't forget anything. The other thing that's frustrating is that even though the co-pilot isn't qualified to operate the controls, that doesn't mean he can't read the checklist to you, or you could at least ask him to review the checklist and make sure you didn't miss anything. I'll admit that it's entirely possible that the pilot in command accomplished all of these checklists silently, but this is highly unlikely for a couple of reasons. According to an individual that had been the pilot's former business partner for 30 years, the pilot in command was the type of pilot who was impressed with someone who could climb into the airplane and take off with minimal use of a checklist. Another person that had flown with him said the pilot was the old cantankerous captain and didn't like to use a checklist. He just jumped in the airplane and went. The other thing that we never hear on the audio is any sort of briefing to cover the emergency procedures. Now, it's possible this was accomplished outside of the aircraft prior to the flight, but given what happened on takeoff, this was most likely not the case. Whenever you fly, you always want to review your takeoff emergency procedures. If you have another pilot with you, then you need to brief them on what you want them to do during the takeoff roll, the types of things that you're going to abort the takeoff for, and then the big one is what are you going to do if you have an engine failure on takeoff? Part of the problem is their timeline. They only had 7 minutes from the time the second engine was started until they applied takeoff power. And I've never flown the King Air 350, but according to some pilots that have, this is not enough time to accomplish all of the checklist. So they've now made it to the end of the runway, and the pilot hasn't even started the takeoff roll, and we've already uncovered multiple reckless mistakes. But pay attention to what happens next, because these mistakes were just the tip of the iceberg. At 9, 10, and 10 seconds, the pilot increased the RPM for takeoff, and they started rolling down the runway. The co-pilot said airspeed's alive, meaning the airspeed indicator is working, and at 9, 10, and 34 seconds, the pilot rotated the nose and the aircraft lifted off the runway. 6 seconds later, the pilot flying said, "What in the world?" and the stall warning horn went off. The co-pilot immediately responded, "You just lost your left engine." For the next 8 seconds, all that is heard is the bank angle warning and the stall warning horn until the aircraft impacted the hangar just 17 seconds after becoming airborne. The question that we're left with is that if it wasn't a weight and balance issue and it wasn't an engine failure, then what happened during the takeoff that caused them to crash? Now, the co-pilot in the story is a pilot monitoring, and he's watching the engine instruments during the takeoff, and he called out that the airspeed was alive, but he never called out any other speeds during the takeoff roll. This is important because there are 3 speeds that every multi-engine aircraft pilot wants to know when they take off. That's your V1, your VR, and your V2 speeds. V1 is your takeoff decision speed. It's kind of the point of no return. Basically, in a multi-engine aircraft, if you lose an engine prior to V1, you abort, and if the engine fails after V1, you continue the takeoff. VR is your rotation speed, and V2 is essentially your takeoff safety speed. This is the speed that you're going to climb out at with one engine inoperative. Based on the aircraft weight and balance, the NTSB determined that V1 was 106 knots, VR was 110 knots, and V2 was 117 knots. According to the sound spectrum analysis, the pilot began rotating the nose of the aircraft pretty early at only 102 knots. And even though the aircraft will still get airborne, this is very dangerous because it decreases the margin to the minimum controllable airspeed, and it reduces the amount of time that you have to react if you lose an engine. Now, if he had actually calculated the weight and balance, or if he had briefed the co-pilot to call out these speeds, he could have avoided this reckless mistake. But the situation is going to get worse because he uses 2 hands to pull back on the controls, and several witnesses described this as a steep rotation, even thinking that the airplane was showboating or performing aerobatics. But this wasn't too surprising because interviews with others that had flown with the accident pilot verified that this was a common practice for him to do. This brings us to the most critical phase of flight and a series of mistakes that led to the crash, and this never should have happened because according to the NTSB, the aircraft should have been controllable. Just seconds after the pilot pulled back on the controls, he recognized a problem as the aircraft started banking to the left. Now, to help counteract this movement, the aircraft is equipped with something called rudder boost that reduces the amount of rudder pedal force required when you experience a sudden decrease in thrust from one engine. The system is armed by moving the control switch to the rudder boost position, and this is per the before takeoff checklist. But it was impossible to determine with certainty from the wreckage whether the system was active during the flight. The co-pilot saw that left engine RPM decreasing and assumed it was an engine failure, but the problem is that's not what happened. The King Air 350 can sometimes experience something called power lever migration. This is when the power levers roll back on their own if the friction control isn't set tight enough. The looser that friction control is, the easier it is for those levers to move. This is why we use checklists, because the before engine start and the before takeoff checklist both have a step for the pilot to ensure that the friction is set. However, the aircraft should have still been controllable by the pilot, so what else went wrong? Since the pilots assumed that they lost an engine, the aircraft manufacturer's engine out procedure during takeoff says that the landing gear should be retracted once a positive rate of climb is established, but this never happened. The pilot flying had never allowed the co-pilot to touch any of the controls on the previous flights, so it's very likely that the co-pilot was just waiting for the pilot to handle the situation, and neither of them raised the gear. The next step is to maintain your V2 takeoff safety speed until you're 400 feet above the ground, and then you should feather the prop on the bad engine to reduce the drag on that side, but this never happened either. They never got higher than 100 feet above the ground. In either case, they didn't need to feather the prop. They just needed to push the power lever back up to the takeoff power setting, which they didn't do. The next step in the checklist says to raise the flaps at V2 plus 9 knots. And this was interesting because several sections of flaps were found in the wreckage, and based on the position of the jack screw actuators for the flaps, the manufacturer said the flaps would have been at a position between 0 and 10 degrees when they crashed. The aircraft manual says that flaps can be up for takeoff, or they can be 14 degrees. There's no option between. So this means that either the pilot tried to raise the flaps too early, which would have reduced their lift, or he tried to lower them, but it was too late. And despite all of the mistakes up to this point, they still could have saved the aircraft, except for one more mistake that the pilot made. And this last mistake is not something that I would consider reckless. This is simply a mistake that any pilot can make in the heat of the moment, because despite all the training that you might have, you never know how you're going to react when you're in an emergency situation that you haven't encountered in real life before. The NTSB concluded it's likely that when the pilot experienced the loss of thrust on the left side, the pilot applied left rudder, the opposite input needed to maintain lateral control, before applying right rudder seconds later. However, by then, the airplane's roll rate was increasing too rapidly and its altitude was too low to recover. Unfortunately, this was another terrible tragedy that never should have happened. Calculate your weight and balance. Use the checklist. Take your time. Don't rush things. And if you're going to have another pilot with you, then you need to make them a member of your team and actually use them. They're not just along for the ride. I hope you learned something new from this debrief in order to keep you safe. And be sure to watch another debrief on the channel, and I'll see you next time.